So, good morning, everybody. I'm welcoming you to the second day of our workshop on Van Gogh TV and on the upkeep and restoration and the upkeeping of digital culture. Yesterday I learned at Twitter that there's even a hashtag, digital dark ages, meaning that we might enter a period where the digital content we all interact with today, that we look at on the net or that we have on our computer, might not be accessible forever because standards change, because people are neglected. And what we're going to do today, partly in German, partly in English, by the way, the first presentation is in English, that's why I'm speaking in English. But what we're going to do today is look at different methods and different approaches and different organizations and institutions that try to do something about this bit rot or this loss of digital information, because otherwise future generations might not know much about us, as we don't know much about the Middle Ages, for example, or periods where people could not write. The first speaker today comes all the way from New York to us today, Michael Connor, and he's the artistic director of an organization that for internet projects has a really long lifespan already. Rhizome was started in 1995 as a platform for digital art and for media art and net art in particular, and it has been around ever since. These days it's associated with the new museum, and earlier this year there was an exhibition of net art from the collection that Rhizome has gathered in the last decades, and this problem again became quite obvious that yes, many pieces are difficult to access, even if they're just 20 years old, and Rhizome has a very developed and very big program to do something about it, and that's what Michael is going to talk about to us, what he's going to talk to us. Talk about to us today. Why don't we just go ahead and begin?
Thank you so much, Tilman, and thank you for bringing me all the way over for this. It's really exciting to be here. I was excited to receive the invitation because of the illustrious names involved in this project, so it's really a pleasure. I'm going to set this up so that I can steer hands-free. Give me just a moment. Thanks. So, good morning. A campaign offering artist multiples to backers available on a crowdfunding platform. A zip file downloaded to a user's computer containing nested folders of thumbnail images whose captions make up a novella when read according to date created. A website where on each visit a different work is embedded. When the next work appears, the previous ones are no longer available. This is just a really small sample of some of the bewildering array of projects that have circulated online in recent years under the label of online exhibition. While gallery exhibitions have a recognizable default in the white cube, visitors to an online exhibition can expect to encounter any number of structures and formats. This open-endedness brings an intoxicating sense of freedom to exhibition organizers, but it also destabilizes the very definition of what an exhibition is. At best, this categorical instability allows viewers to understand the exhibition as a variable, context-dependent cultural practice, and to imagine how it might outlive the specific architectural setting to which it was, for a time, largely bound, that is, the white cube. But at worst, it's just confusing. What exactly is an online exhibition? So I was invited here to share with you the key lessons learned during our project at Rhizome, Net Art Anthology, which is the recent online exhibition that we did, and I'll talk more about it. So I wanted to, in particular, talk about lessons that we learned about preservation, but I felt that I couldn't approach those lessons without talking about net art anthology first and foremost as an online exhibition, which is how the project began. So we'll get to those issues of preservation and memory through the question of exhibition making. Net art anthology was a project that focused on net art, which we define as being not just about the creative use of the net, but also about examining the conditions of participation in it. So net art, in Rhizome's view, is sometimes involving in performatic or participatory elements, and it's not strictly limited to the digitalized material in a narrow sense, especially important now since the line between what is offline and what is online is increasingly blurred. So although many of the things I want to bring up today are preservation issues, I want to push these exhibition making issues, and in particular talk about the issues that emerge when net art is presented out of its original context, which is a really key issue in net art exhibitions all around. In the year 2000, the artist Olia Lialina published an article in the Russian language magazine Du, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, about her thoughts on exhibitions of net art under the title All You Need Is a Link. This is a translation of the article that we republished a couple years ago. In this article, she defined an exhibition as any event that doesn't classify as a conference and involves net art. So she called net art exhibitions the ugliest phenomenon of the modern art scene, and contended that only a living, smiling, proud, famous net artist who comments and explains her own work can truly draw attention to it and engage the audience, which is a pretty provocative statement for a curator to read. So that said, although she's very down on exhibitions of net art, she found the least damaging type of exhibition to be the so-called lazy exhibition, where curators merely link to a given work. Almost any other mode of exhibition making, according to Olia, would remove net art from its context and make it look primitive. The first exhibition that I worked on as a curator followed this so-called lazy model. Curated by Shu Li Chang, Armin Madash, and Yukiko Shikata, the online exhibition Kingdom of Piracy began as a project sponsored by the Acer Corporation in Taiwan to celebrate artists' resistance to the copyright regime and embrace of alternative strategies. In the context of a major anti-piracy push in Taiwan, the sponsorship ended, but the curators continued the project, finding a home first at Ars Electronica in 2002, and then the project was expanded for a presentation at FACT in Liverpool, which was at my invitation. The exhibition design was exemplary. A horizontal scrolling sea featuring floating buoys that were labeled with the names of projects or artists. Each buoy was linked to a range of external sites with no further context provided. As new works were added, the sea would expand. Shu Li, in her inimitable style, described the exhibition design as artworks floating in the open source open sea. It was an exhibition in the form of a loose network, which came into focus through the staging of events, performances, panels, and pop-up exhibitions. For its presentation at FACT, the curators behind Kingdom of Piracy decided to focus on collaborative platforms, shared networks, and cultural techniques in different communities for artistic and cultural purposes. Kingdom of Piracy gave a visual, discursive form to a set of relations among living, breathing projects on the network. It was respectful of each project's dynamic context, and it didn't attempt to decontextualize. But this type of curation rests on projects that are live and ongoing, whether new or old. Its ethics may be straightforward and commendable, but sometimes, as the people in this room know well, a link isn't all you need, even when it comes to web-based art. So, about net art anthology. There are a lot of projects in net art anthology, in which case a link was certainly not enough. But I'm going to give you a little bit of the context for Rhizome and for this project. As Tilman mentioned, Rhizome is an organization based in New York. We're affiliated with the New Museum since 2003, and we were founded in 1996 in Berlin by an artist named Mark Tribe, originally as an online community, and went through lots of different iterations of what we might be before eventually coming to the kind of model of being an organization that involved discussion, online discussion and context, involved supporting artists' practice through grants and other activities like that, and also involved an archive early on. So it had this element of supporting new practice and also kind of serving as a sort of nascent memory institution. And it's really had that same structure for more than 20 years at this point. NetArt Anthology began in 2016. It was an initiative funded by the Carl and Marilyn Thoma Art Foundation as one of their first project grants, as a private collection that's interested in raising the kind of profile of digital art, because that's one of the core aspects of their collection. And so they were interested in this project as a way of kind of raising the level of awareness around the history of that field. For Rhizome, the anthology was intended as an effort to address what felt like a gap. While there are a number of histories of net art, most of them didn't offer a primary experience of the work. So we wanted to create a history of net art that was broad in scope, and then also foregrounded the work itself. We also cautiously described the project as sketching a possible canon. So the structure of the project was meant to be 100 works from 1982 to the present day, which were selected for artistic significance, but also representing kind of a broad field of practice. And we used this phrase of the canon, which is one that is sort of much maligned in artistic discourse as a whole, and specifically in net art as well. So we used the phrase a bit cautiously, knowing that it would be like somewhat controversial. But I feel like by making this list, we were already sort of engaging in that process of canon making. So it felt like the most honest thing to do was to sort of confess that. It would have felt dishonest to kind of claim that this project, which involved creating a list of institutionally sanctioned works, wasn't in some way a canon-making project. However, it was our hope that using the phrase would also highlight the stakes of making this history more visible and encourage others to sort of vocally argue for their own selections or offer their own versions of the history. It draws its title, Net Art Anthology, from the Anthology Film Archives, which is an institution in New York, where in the 70s, it was founded by Jonas Mikas, the Lithuanian filmmaker. And in the 70s, they had a project of drawing together what they called the Essential Cinema Collection, which was the sort of collection of films that were meant to define cinema as an art form. It was a selection made by 5 white men. It fell apart in controversy and acrimony. They all sort of like hated each other by the end, and they never finished the project. It was intended to be ongoing. So in some ways, it was like a total failure. But on the other hand, that collection of films has served as the basis for Anthology's repertory screenings over the past decades. So on a sort of random rainy Wednesday, you can walk into Anthology Film Archives and see one of the films from that list, such as Battleship Potemkin. And we were really drawn to like the kind of, idea of anthology as this like really flawed model of how to create history, because there's maybe no way that's not flawed and subjective. But then also the idea of having the archives serve as this repertory resource that could be rehearsed for new audiences. At this point, I wanted to go to the website, and my link is broken, so I'm going to try and, Good, I'm glad that Tilman didn't have a weird start page there. So we structured the project with 5 chapters, which were chronological, the first 4, and then the 5th was sort of an addendum where we had an opportunity to go back and revisit the projects of the past that we had sort of missed along the way. We released 1 project per week, or that was the intention, although we kind of fell apart in sort of the process of sort of restoring and researching and discussing all of these works in depth. But the kind of project launched in 2016 with this as the first piece, and we used a range of different strategies for revisiting these works, which ranged from simple documentation to kind of complete technical restoration. In this case, this is a project by the Australian collective VNS Matrix, which was a kind of famous propaganda effort in the early 90s, where they spread this text that they wrote and later added a graphic to. Which people have kind of characterized this as a utopian kind of idea that cyberspace would be feminist or feminine coded, and my own kind of contention is that that's not what they were exactly doing. That they understood that patriarchy was sort of taking hold very deeply in these supposedly new infrastructures, and that they wanted to contest it. So it wasn't that they saw them as inherently feminist, but they were staking a claim against what they saw as like a deep-rooted patriarchy. So when I hear people describe this as utopian, I think that's exactly wrong, because it was in fact like a critique of what was happening in those spaces already. But the way that we represented this particular work, because it began as a text that was often distributed online, was you could just enter your email to receive it from a kind of VNS matrix email address by text, and you could also download a printable poster that that was based on the one that they would kind of wheat paste around around Sydney and Adelaide. And it had wheat paste instructions. So we did some wheat pasting around the streets of New York and made these available for free at our lunch event. So there was kind of like a range of, I think we wanted to start with that work partly as a way of sort of opening up the toolbox a bit and saying we were going to have a lot of different strategies for presentation. How do I get back to my slideshow? Fenster?
Yes.
This one? Yes. Thank you. So later on we added, we further developed the project of net art anthology. Although it was an online exhibition, we then created a gallery exhibition, which I'll talk a bit more about later, but that exhibition is currently touring. It didn't involve all 100 works, but it involved sort of a selection that we felt maybe helped address some of the core philosophical issues that emerged throughout the project, issues around recirculation and revisiting works of the past. And we also published this book, which does include the 100 works and images and critical texts around the field as a whole. Okay, so that's sort of an overview of the net art anthology project. And I want to kind of, at this point, talk about the deeper origins of it, because Rhizome, as I mentioned, began as an archiving organization. And this project was specifically sort of something that emerged from our needs as an archiving institution. So in 1999, Rhizome founded a digital art archive called the Art Base. It was started by Mark Tribe. It's okay. There's a video, but it's not so important. But the Art Base was, already 3 years into Rhizome's founding, it had become quite apparent that preservation of digital art was going to be a real issue. And so he wanted to set up this archive system. He didn't have a background as a archivist, which sort of became important later on. And but he did have, I think, a lot of respect for the artists in the field. And in the process of setting up the archive, he had many conversations with artists about what their own hopes and wishes for an archive like this would be. And one of the interesting decisions that was made was, especially in Europe, he found that many artists didn't feel comfortable giving a copy of their work to an American organization. And beyond that, they didn't know what it meant for something to be controlled on their own server, but also to exist on another server, which is a very viable kind of question. If you're actively maintaining a work, why would you relinquish kind of control? So that meant that the Rhizome archive early on had this structure where it involved what Mark called cloned objects, which were ones that were copied to the Rhizome servers, and then linked objects, which were ones that were merely described in Rhizome's catalog, and then sort of linked outwards from there. So it was a really interesting and radical strategy. And on top of that, Mark also had a really strong ethos of openness. So the Art Base's acquisition policy was that anyone could be a part of it as long as your work was of potential, or I don't even know if, actually I think at the beginning, you just had to have work that was categorizable as new media art. So they would more or less accept anything unless they thought it was not part of that category. So there was some gatekeeping that was still present, but for the most part, it was quite open. Which was, I think, like an interesting basis for an archive. And interesting when you think about the ethics of the Art Base in relation to something like archive.org, which was collecting everything without asking. And I think the Rhizome archive had a sort of ethos early on of like, having respect for the artist's wishes in terms of the deposit process. So what we've ended up with is this archive of 2,000 works, not all of which are kind of contained in the collection, and which are in a really diverse range of kinds of states of play. Like some are gone and some are still in existence, but are actually an entirely different thing. And then there was text, which was sort of written once by an artist and submitted at that point, which might reflect like the bottle of wine they had that night or whatever else, but it kind of is like never, in most cases been edited since. So it's this really unusual database, but also something that's like of no small significance, because there's few things that are like it that capture that period in time. So in terms of the questions that arise for us around these around this archive, there are like these two dimensions of it that are real issues that I think net art anthology was sort of a response to in some way. And one is the question of sort of archiving at scale. That is to say, when I arrived at Rhizome in 2013, I thought, I'll work on updating these records, and we'll preserve works in the art base, and we'll make this archive really clean and neat, and people can find it really accessible. And once you start banging your head against the scale of what's in there, you realize that that's totally implausible and actually doesn't make any sense. Because, for example, like if you have a text written by an artist and it contains a claim that you think to yourself, I don't know if that claim is true, maybe I'll fact check that. Then your one day of your life is gone just fact checking the one artist's claim, as Tilman will know. So the scale of the information in there is kind of like, it's sort of like unmanageable, and it has to be sort of understood as what it is. We have to find ways of making that transparent, but it's not like a kind of traditional curatorial database of work. And the other kind of, besides the scale problem, there's also this other aspect of the art base, which is that it's not just that it's 2,000 works, which seems like a big number, but it's also that it's intensely variable works that changed rapidly. And so what we realized, and this is research that my colleague Dragan Espenshad has been bringing in, is that a classic database basically can't work for this type of field. Because a classic database is based on this principle of describing objects in a collection, assuming that the objects are relatively stable over time. And what we needed instead was a database that could model dynamic processes, not one that could describe objects. So for this reason, Rhizome has been, for the past 5 years, under Dragan's direction, working on research around how to create a database using Wikidata, which is a linked data model that, when Dragan started this, was really unusable for this purpose, and like through his dogged persistence has gotten to the point where a number of other institutions are starting to adopt it. But I think this is actually a really radical way of approaching something like the field of net art, because it allows you to, instead of creating a single authoritative entry for something, think of each entry that you create as kind of a point in a process, and to sort of describe, and so through all the ways that you kind of manage your collection, you can describe an object's many different states or its kind of process of change over time. And it also, I think very crucially, upends the traditional logic of a museum database, in which there's someone like myself responsible for authoritative records. Because of course, Wikibase is derived from the same kind of structures that run Wikipedia. So it's meant to be interoperable, so that we could have an artist name in Rhizome that's searched through a common interface that yields results in databases held by a range of different institutions. And that means that the kind of authority of any one institution to sort of define this field becomes sort of destabilized, or becomes more foregrounded as a collaborative, shared undertaking. So there's like this great radical dream in all of this that we've been sort of, all working through for several years, and I really encourage people that are working in databases to do with born digital work to make contact with Dragan's research and try and be involved. What's really interesting is that most institutions actually don't want to have their data be interlinked with other institutions. They want it much more closed. So there's a real process of change that I think needs to happen around that, but this is sort of like really important work. So that's sort of like some of the background. So what we've ended up with is this, in a kind of practical sense, is this like really in-depth research project and an art base that really hasn't had a public function for about 7 years now. And so it's frustrating for me because one of my great wishes when I came to Rhizome was to be creating meaning around this archive and contextualizing it and so forth. And so in a sense, it became apparent that in order to do that kind of project, the best way to approach it would actually be to separate it out from the like larger research around archiving net art as a whole, and instead to focus on recirculating a smaller number of works that told a particular kind of story. Okay, so back to the question of exhibition making in relation to the archive. Net Art Anthology was an exhibition and not an archive. It focused on a smaller number of works, and it was much less about an accumulation of information in a database and much more about contextualizing and representing within a certain space and time. And in thinking about how to do that, I was sort of, often puzzling over this question of what the online exhibition is. And so I was looking at some of the things that have been written about exhibition making in a traditional sense. And one of the words that kind of comes up again in any definition of the traditional gallery exhibition is the words object or artifact. And just kind of, this definition is drawn from a book on performance art, so it's being held up as a kind of straw man. Exhibition involves imposition of order on objects. So I was thinking about, what would be an exhibition of online things, because these things aren't objects, and that's one of our big contentions at Rhizome. Or what kind of pressure does the online context place on the category of the object? My colleague Dragan is often saying that digital culture is made up of practices and not objects, so that's one way in which we think of these things as processes that play out over time. These things can only be experienced when enacted within complex ensembles of hardware and software, relying on a range of network resources, audience participation, websites, APIs, or other services. There's a word that we sometimes use when thinking about these works is that they are diffuse. So not only that they're variable, that they have different versions of themselves, but that the boundaries around them are really soft. So in a work like Electronic Cafe, which took place in 1984 in the city of Los Angeles, what do we consider to be a part of the work? Do we consider the communities who participated, the images that they created, the technology that was used, the physical locations where it happened, the murals that were created as part of it? So this socially participatory work opens out in so many directions. So one of the kind of big moves that we need to make as an exhibition maker when trying to represent a work out of its context, beyond just linking, is to come up with a way of artifactualizing, to come up with an object boundary for a work that doesn't have any kind of clear cohesiveness as a standalone work. So I would contend online exhibition making involves giving form to a set of relations among entities on a network. And the problem that we run into with a project like Net Art Anthology is when those entities are not in an active state, when the relations need to be created, not just or reactivated, and not just shown. So with the web, to turn something which has a diffuse or variable presence online, something that's an active process, into something that can be exhibited later, it involves a range of different practical approaches. Many exhibition organizers, faced with this complexity, do what I would call the kind of wrong and heavy-handed thing, which is to sort of force everything into a kind of flat surface. And that's something that we absolutely try to avoid at Rhizome all the time. There was a great example, which is in our archive, of a project called Biennale Online a few years back. That it was meant to be an exclusively online biennial of contemporary art, and it described itself as the first online biennial. This is in 2013. So they invited artist Oliver Larrick to participate. I'm going to change, I don't know, it's not about the slide, but they invited artist Oliver Larrick to participate, and they said, please send us the work, but your work has to be in JPEG format. And Oliver was so upset that he entered into this long kind of trolling campaign against them, basically. But so this is like, I would say, like the heavy-handed approach is to say, oh, everything needs to be reduced down into our kiosk or into this thing. And that is where, as a curator, it's really easy to like be heavy-handed in those moves and do what Oli was kind of warning us against, of decontextualizing and making something look primitive. But there are a number of ways in which works can be allowed to live in a kind of poetic way, even when they're turned into something that's more of a stable object. And one example I would give of kind of good artifactualization is this project by Mendy and Keith Obedike. This is a project that that began as an eBay listing in which Keith's blackness was offered for sale under the category of Black Americana on eBay. It was listed August 8th, 2001. The category of Black Americana is full of racist memorabilia. You can buy sort of like caricatures and miniatures that portray African Americans in like a range of demeaning ways. And eBay pulled this listing after only 4 days, saying that this was inappropriate. So all of the kind of racist memorabilia is appropriate, and this gesture is inappropriate. And the website itself was really funny because it had all these rules for the object that was being sold. For one thing, it said like, this blackness may not be used for telling jokes about race or something like that. So it sort of talked about all of the ways in which blackness can sort of circulate distinct from any individual person in a certain way, the way that blackness is kind of itself circulated as a concept. And it was so precise, I think, in its framing that it was disallowed by the platform, even though it did have some bids. So Mendy and Keith's response to this was to sort of create like basically an HTML reconstruction of the page. And in this particular context, I think that gesture of copying eBay into their own server you can see the URL at the top is obedike.tripod.com, kind of a good classic web hosting service. But here, the idea of copying a web page and making something that was a dynamic auction process into a flat, stable thing had a kind of politics to it, because here it's a way of saying like, we're going to claim ownership of this gesture and claim that documentation for ourselves, and not allow it to be sort of simply lost to eBay's corporate capriciousness. When we presented this work online, there was, there were some technical things that we had to do, but I'll bring this up a little as part of another section. So this is a reconstruction, and it kind of works in that way. But when the work was shown in the Whitechapel exhibition, Electronic Superhighway, we had this nice HTML page, and we reached out to Mendy and Keith to include it in a sort of Rhizome section of that exhibition. And when they wrote back to say that they agreed, they had a specific way in which they wanted the work to show, which was actually as a screenshot. So even though we had this nice interactive copy, they wanted in the exhibition version for it to be even further turned into an object. So here we have the artist that like really wants this to be, decontextualized, taken out, distanced from like something that you would interact with, and made more of an object of contemplation as a gesture. So that's one way in which one might approach artifactualization, creating a replica, a reconstruction, a screenshot, making things available for visual inspection. I think on a kind of other extreme, the way that we sort of take dynamic processes and allow them to be presented for exhibition purposes is through different kinds of preservation strategies around capturing the web. And probably the most advanced of these is called Web Recorder. This is a platform that Rhizome has been developing with Ilya Kramer for several years, 5 years now. And it emerged in response to, I think, an increasing awareness that artists were working in these diffuse ways where their work was taking place not just on a server that they controlled and could zip up and send to us, but that their work was taking place on services, or it pulled in APIs from things like Google Maps. And so like starting at around 2008, the Rhizome art base becomes really chaotic because, the whole thing is chaotic. But in 2008, you started to see a lot more works that relied heavily on external things So if you wanted to copy an artist's work that relied on Google Maps, you'd suddenly have to copy all of Google Maps or something. So given this situation, Ilya initiated and Rahmen has been supporting this this platform, which I'm going to just log in and do a quick demonstration of, because this is something that I think people might find useful in their own work. You can create a free account. I think. Oh. Oh wait. I think your keyboard is in a different location than mine. So if you enter a URL on Web Recorder, who has like a good page in mind to capture? Is there a favorite media website? You could do CNN.com. And you click Start Capture. I'm not going to go into all of the kind of cataloging features, but it basically opens the page that you want to capture in a proxy server and records all of the data that the server is sending to your browser. So here you can see it's capturing the web as we browse. It's captured 2.5 megabytes. The thing that I wanted was like a video clip. Here we go. Where is my video? Web TV. Well, live TV might be a tricky use case for it, but just to go back to. Whoops. I just lost my recording because I didn't give it. Oh, online exhibition. So what it's done is taken all the pages that I looked at just now while browsing and turned them into sort of replayable, what they're called work files. It's basically just like a file that has all of the like video and images and HTML smashed into a single kind of file format. And it's sort of extremely sort of stable over time. So what happens is that anything that I clicked on during that browsing session is captured, and anything that I didn't is outside the edges of the collection. So I'm clicking on links that are not part of it. But if I go back to where's my link that I clicked on? It was like down here somewhere. So the pages that I selected in the past should be a part of my archive. And this is an archive that, it could contain like YouTube clips or embedded media, and it's within that single file format. So you could turn it into something that is played offline in a gallery exhibition or something like that. Oh, there was a video there, and so right now I'm in browsing mode. So we could be like totally, we could download this and have that same experience offline. But I've realized that I should have played the video to capture that. So I'm actually going to go up here to patch this URL, and we can capture that data that we missed on the first round. So if there is a playable video here, we'll get it. So the other like cool, I don't know if that's a video or not. The other cool trick is that if you are trying to capture something that has Flash or Java in it, you can actually use a browser that's running on the server that supports those formats. So this is something that many people will be running into now, is that all of your Flash work doesn't work anymore. So if you go to Web Recorder and you open a page in Firefox 49, then you can actually access the work through a version of Firefox that's running on Rhizome's infrastructure that supports Flash, and you can capture the data and interact with it as you would on your own computer and make a kind of flat version of this dynamic web-based work. So the Java one is especially cool because Java is something that is been particularly a nightmare for archiving purposes. So when you capture them in those formats, when you go back to replay it, it will replay it within that same browser environment. And what's great about using the remote browsers is that anything that's proprietary about the browser that you might have installed on your laptop could get in the way of the stability of an archive that you make. Whereas if you use the emulated browsers, those are ones that we know we can support in the future. So yeah, so now.
Ireland is probably the world's most famous location for seeing wildlife.
All right, so now I've got that video about sharks in my archive, and we should be able to. Do we want to go back to it, or have we belabored the point enough? Oh, I did something wrong. I think I'm going to move away from this live demo because it's too hazardous. But I will say that just trust me that it works. So we used Web Recorder quite a bit in NetArt Anthology, and one of the particular ways that it is useful for a project where you're kind of going back to the past is when you are trying to find a work that's in web archives and is difficult to piece together. So one particular place where we were able to use this to sort of spectacular effect is on Seth Price's video Dispersion, or sorry, his piece Dispersion, where how do I do Command F? So this is a project that Seth Price began in 2002 that was a really influential piece of writing about how artists can approach the internet as kind of circulatory medium. And in this project, he created a PDF text and also a range of other works. But as part of this, he had built a page on his website that involved links to all these articles about the Daniel Pearl murder, which was a journalist killed in Pakistan in 2002 by, I guess, Al-Qaeda back then. I was working on my computer last night. So what Web Recorder allows you to do is basically paste in a link from the Internet Archive, and it will actually capture that into a kind of web resource that that you can use it to actually match things along with contemporary web resources. So if you have a page that has some files from 2002 that are on the Internet Archive, and some from 2007, and some from 2012. By pasting those URLs into Web Recorder, you can actually reassemble the page retrospectively. And maybe an easy way to assemble that, or to visualize that, is through another interface that we created for web archives called oldweb.today. So I'm just going to show you how this works. We have the same emulated browser system, and put in a URL, and it will pull different pages together, often from multiple web archives, to reassemble an experience of that page from a certain date in history. So Rhizome.org, circa 2003. And then down here it tells you where the archives are drawing from. So it's from 2 different resources on Internet Archive. So sometimes you see 3 or 4 different web archives being kind of. So all of this is this material is distributed in different places. It's on different servers. It's on social media, and Web Recorder is a primary way in which we try and resynthesize those into object-based works. How am I doing on time, Tilman?
What?
How am I on time?
Fine. 10 more, 15 more minutes.
Okay. So I was able to reconstruct this page from Seth's website in 2002 that had no longer existed, but not only was I able to get the page, but many of the links that he captured were available in different levels on various public web archives. So we were able to make like a really nice standalone archive of this work, which had been lost just by drawing these works together and then synthesizing them into a sort of standalone web archive object. Another key aspect of our process with NetArt Anthology involved emulation. Emulation is a really fun one to talk about because I suppose that when we talk about all of digital culture being made up of practices and not objects, one of the sort of points that we're making is that when you have a digital file, it needs to be enacted in a very specific environment, or else it doesn't make sense. So to think about collecting digital work without collecting the software that it relies on is sort of it doesn't really work. Like, it's a good way to end up with a collection that's completely inaccessible in the future. If you have a 1997 Microsoft Word document, you might be lucky and be able to open it in 2019. But the only way to really be sure of that is to maintain your copy of 1997 Microsoft Word, for example. And so this is a real issue to the extent that Rhizome now has a full-time software curator who's responsible for maintaining the software systems that we use to access work of the past. And what I sort of like about that these problems philosophically is that our approach to trying to maintain these works is not to alter them, right? To like keep the work as close to its original state as possible and replicate its surrounding environment through more and more elaborate strategies of presentation. So I'll give you an example of where Dragan, my colleague in Stuttgart, is with his emulation research now. So this is Alexei Shulgin's form art, a project which will be probably known to many people in this room. Alexei was an artist living in Moscow, and I think he was really interested in the web's openness, its potential to like spark like different kinds of collaborations among communities of participation. He also had a very funny sense of humor. So he started this new art form called form art, which was basically designed around using the sort of default elements of HTML in order to create designs and animations and so forth. Now this is a work that was like a preservation success story because it was part of Rhizome's art base and the files were safely stored there and also on C3, so you could go and access the work in 2019 and it would still be there. But because it was running all of these HTML kinds of buttons and forms, it didn't really work in the same way that it used to. You can imagine that visiting these pages in Google Chrome of today would give a very different experience than Netscape 3. So this was a really good use case for emulation because we had the unmodified sort of original files and we're able to create a software environment using this system we've been developing with the University of Freiburg called Emulation as a Service. So Dragan sets up environments where people can access an emulated version of Netscape 3 in their browser. And so we're making like basically a kind of video, real-time video connection to a computer that's running on a server, and it allows us to interact with the work in real time. This is actually not a fully emulated environment. It's the old browser running in like a partial emulation. It allows us to run this more cheaply. Has anyone ever won this game? I can never win this game. It's like impossible. So in relation to our question of, okay, so if I click here, and it's going to start moving, and then, oh, I lost. Never works. Yeah, and some of the works in NetArt Anthology are also software-based and not just HTML. So an example of that would be Mongrel's Blacklash, which was a modified version of the video game Mac Attack. And this one, it looked like the infrastructure was down last night. It's always fun to try when we're all together here and we can have that feeling of drama. Is the computer gonna start up or not? Yeah, it doesn't look good. But in relation to our question, so this is like, even when there is what seems like an object, it's still not really an object because the whole thing around it is as important as the object itself. So that's sort of in relation to our question of exhibit, finding the artifacts to exhibit. So we can draw the object boundary around the HTML files, but really the object needs to be considered within an overall software environment, and also it had a social environment, which is now gone. Blacklash, not gonna work, maybe. It's also possible that this is like using some port that's blocked here, actually. Start emulator. You can also choose different locations for your server because there's more lag time when it's further away. Oh, well, we'll have to give up on that emulation. But you got a taste of it with Forward. So those were two of the more technical strategies that we used as part of NetArt Anthology. And I wanted to say a few words about the strategy of reperformance, which also kind of came up in, there's another link that I wanted to show. I just wanted to kind of give you an example for contrast of a different approach to restoration of a web-based work that's not derived from emulation. This is Shuli Cheng's Brandon, a 1999 web commission, which is part of NetArt Anthology. And this project was a web narrative that also involved real space presentations in Boston, New York, and Amsterdam. Anywhere else, Josephine? Those 3 locations. And it involved chat rooms online and chat performances. It involved also these HTML kind of narratives. And it was a legendary project, and part of the reason it was legendary was not only because of its scale, and it got into all these interesting theoretical issues around the gendered body and the relationship of the gendered body to the internet. But on top of that, I forget how to navigate down. It's been too long. On top of that, the Guggenheim also sort of famously took this project down after just 1 or 2 years of being online. They didn't want to pay the server costs, or they didn't want to update it, or so forth. So for many years, it was missing. And there was a really interesting kind of restoration project of it that basically took all of the code of this project, the 100,000 lines of it, and rewrote it for modern browsers. So what you're seeing here is the results of this really intensive restoration process. So all of the Java, all of the JavaScript, everything that wasn't running properly in a modern browser. And then also they made interpretations that allowed the work to, I think, look better in the larger screen size and so forth. So this was an incredibly labor-intensive process. And I think what they made was something that's like quite beautiful and striking. But it's actually quite different than the experience of looking at it on the kind of small emulated environment. So in terms of like looking at the work of the past, this is like the sort of counterpoint to the emulation strategy. This would be a strategy you would think of as migration, of taking that original object and intervening in it to allow it to function in a kind of new environment. And I think this is a successful example of that, but it does sort of illustrate the incredible resources needed to make that sort of happen. Because once you start intervening in the level of the code, you get into really a lot of pain. And whereas something like FormArt just kind of works right out of the box, more or less. I will say that we tried to emulate Brandon, and it wasn't like completely functioning, and we don't know why. Like, because we had, we just were like, oh, let's try it. And there were all sorts of like issues that were kind of thrown up by it. So there was some I'm not sure that we had the original version of it from 1999, or there was some like mysteries. So the Guggenheim restoration is kind of like only authoritative version that exists now. So that's sort of like the counterpoint to emulation. And I wanted to mention it just as a way of leading into this, which is Shuli Chang's garlic equals rich air. And like Guggenheim, who kind of reinterpreted that Brandon for modern browsers, we had to reinterpret this work pretty significantly. And in 2003, Shuli did this, or 2002, Shuli did this roving performance on the streets of New York, where she walked around with a group of weird performance artists trying to trade organic garlic that she had grown upstate for Wi-Fi. And they entered into these like really surreal barters on the streets of New York with like Wall Street stockbrokers, and they had this huge truck full of garlic, and they were like trying to make this exchange between the digital and the physical, which really sparks my imagination in thinking about like how networks of adaptation and survival and exchange and currency are so interesting to people right now. So this project sort of exists as this weird, it was like weirdly imagining where we are today with these issues in some ways, where the organic garlic functioned as this digital currency almost. And she created an online trading game where people could trade for virtual garlic and so forth. So as part of our working with this, we did restore one of the versions of the website, but when you look at it, it's like really difficult to use from a 2019 perspective. Like the game is very unplayable. So we talked to Shuli and we decided that we would like re-perform this project in like basically a completely different way than the original. We made our own garlic cart. We commissioned we grew a bunch of garlic on Shuli's farm upstate, and we commissioned artist Melanie Hoff to make like an entirely new garlic trading game. So the reason we did that is that we thought what was important of this original project wasn't the website, it wasn't the truck, it was that people were trading garlic for Wi-Fi. So to get people to do that, we had to create an entirely new sort of situation for them to engage in. And Shuli was sort of like excited about that, and she was also working on her, Venice Biennale Pavillon, so she didn't have any time. So she sort of was like, "Oh, that sounds great. Go ahead." And so yeah, what we did has like a very tenuous relationship with the original in that case, but I think kind of honors the spirit of what that original project was about. Okay, so those are like different sort of strategies on a more practical level that we employed in terms of like bringing these diffuse non-objects into a kind of artifactual position within the exhibition, the online exhibition. And I wanted to kind of, to say that that was sort of like one level of the project. The second level of the project became when we had the gallery version, we had to kind of find like another artifactual life for these projects within that space. And so there was a lot of sort of thinking about that. Some of the projects that we selected for the gallery exhibition spoke to the themes of net art anthology and already had a format that worked well for the gallery space. But I just wanted to kind of point out that we did have pretty good success with our emulated works that we showed in the gallery space here. This is Mark Trabb's Starry Night, made with Alex Galloway and Martin Wattenberg. It was an interface to the Rhizome art base that ran in a Java applet, and we presented it on this desk, very kind of clean surface, correct height for a wheelchair user. It was set to restart after 5 minutes without usage. And what's great about these emulated environments is that they run in a USB stick, so people can't mess it up. Like the software environment can be swapped out really easily. The thing they could do is steal the USB stick, which didn't happen. Luckily, no one realized it was there. But it really makes a very impregnable kind of robust exhibition sort of solution. And we used a CRT monitor because of the aesthetics of that are so important. It's like the one hardware that we must have. But then we had a little Intel NUC computer, so we showed the modern hardware under it to make it kind of transparent that we were doing a kind of process of emulation. And I guess so. These are all different ways in which we tried to deal with the question of exhibiting practices which were no longer active on the network, to bring them back to a new kind of life, to turn them into more stable artifacts, and there's some of the strategies that were used. It's interesting because my first online exhibition for Rhizome, I wanted to kind of close with, because it conjures the story of Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is in some way like this great Western example of like the problems of like what you could do wrong as a net art curator, like stealing the kind of religious object and being like a very bad colonial anthropologist, going in and taking from this sacred culture something of great value and not treating it with respect. So it's sort of funny that my first project with Rhizome referred to that as a kind of organizing metaphor for looking back at net art of the past. And this was in 2005, a collaboration with Dragon Espen Shed, long before either of us worked at Rhizome, where we did an exhibition in the form of a blog, looking at works that were old and decrepit from the art base. So basically, I've been doing the same thing for 15 years now. And yeah, with that, I'll close. Any final questions for the last minute or two?
Yeah, let's see if there's any questions. First of all, thank you very much. Are there any questions or remarks from the audience? Yes.
Thank you so much. Such an inspiration. Where do you draw the line with the restoration? I mean, it's very labor intensive. It costs a lot of money. Do you work with community, volunteers, students? What are your criteria?
There's absolutely no criteria.
Brilliant.
Because the thing is that any line that you draw has to be drawn specific to the situation, and then the line has to be made transparent. So there's no classic line between like what's ethical and what's not. There's no like hard and fast rule. So in many cases, it could be terrible to make a replica of a website, but for the Obadikas, that made sense. And in some cases, like it might be a colonizing gesture to spend $100,000 rewriting a website, but for Brandon, that was the right strategy. So I think, yeah, there's no hard and fast rules, unfortunately. And I think it's important to know that and to highlight what your particular rules for any given situation are.
I was wondering, were there any artists that didn't want to be included in the anthology, or they could say, I can take care of these things by myself, or I don't want to be part of a canon that you are devising?
The canon issue was less of an issue. I feel like people have been through a long journey with that question already. But we did have an artist collective where one artist said that she would participate if we donated the other member's artist fee to Planned Parenthood, and then the other artist declined to participate. And I don't know what the backstory was there, but that didn't end up happening.
We wonder, of course, who the artist
Well, no one that's actually in that art anthology. But I think that there also was an artist that, there were a lot of complicated conversations. Yeah, as you can imagine.
All right, thank you very much. Oh, one more question.
Yeah. Thank you, first of all. I was wondering, lots of these net art projects stem from smaller communities, like, subcultures, these things. So is there any thought about what you kind of need to understand those pieces also to preserve that? I mean, there's the technical side to bring them up again, to look at them nowadays. But, if it was 20 years ago, how are you able to see all these small details that were obvious back then because people, knew MySpace or knew how to navigate and work on MySpace. So, where is there any process to capture culture or communities in a form?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the points of the diffusiveness way of thinking is that when you're setting your boundary of what you're capturing and what you're not, it's important to think really horizontally and broadly. So interviews could be a part of a process like what you're describing. There's always going to be some amount of what's included and what's not. This is another slide from Electronic Cafe, a kind of personal favorite and I think maybe like another kind of place to end this talk would be to say that there's a lot of unfinished business in net art anthology. And so this project is one where I'd love to spend a year talking to all of the people that were a part of it and understand what the stories of it were and that sort of thing. So those things are definitely within the constellation of things you might need to consider as part of a presentation. And we tried to, I think, with the net art anthology pages, capture a lot of that context.
All right, again, thank you very much. We're going to take a 15-minute break now. This will also be probably an opportunity to ask Michael a question not in front of the audience, and then we'll be back with our first panel. Thank you very much again.